Hello, and welcome to Lotus Light Teachings, a space where we explore the profound wisdom of Buddhism and the timeless lessons that guide us toward inner peace and fulfillment. Today, we embark on a deeply personal journey, one that many of us will inevitably face. As the years pass, as life shifts and relationships change, we may find ourselves wondering, after all I have given, what is left for me? If you've ever felt unappreciated, unnoticed, or uncertain about where you belong in the grand unfolding of life, then this message is for you. It's time to stop chasing, stop longing, and start embracing the art of letting go. In today's discussion, we will uncover the truth behind attachment, the power of silence, and the freedom that comes from choosing yourself. So settle in, take a deep breath, and allow these words to guide you toward a life of true peace and purpose. Have you ever had a moment of stillness where the world seemed to move on without you? You sit in a quiet room, perhaps with a cup of tea in your hands, and suddenly, a thought crosses your mind. Where did all the years go? For decades, you have given your energy to others, raising children, supporting loved ones, building a career. You have poured yourself into relationships, into responsibilities, into the endless cycle of meeting expectations. And yet, as time passes, you may find yourself alone, wondering if anyone truly sees you anymore. The phone calls come less often. The family gatherings grow fewer. The people you once nurtured are now caught up in their own struggles, their own dreams, and in the silence, a quiet realization emerges. Love given does not always return in the way we expect. But what if this silence is not emptiness, but an invitation? An invitation to turn inward, to embrace solitude, to reclaim your energy. Buddhism teaches us that attachment to expectations is the root of suffering. We believe that love and loyalty should be reciprocated, but life does not follow a predictable script. The river of existence flows forward, regardless of our hopes and wishes. So what do we do when the world moves on? How do we find peace when the love we gave is not mirrored back to us? The answer is simple, yet profound. It is time to choose yourself, not out of selfishness, but out of wisdom. In this journey, we will explore the illusion of reciprocity, why expecting fairness in love often leads to suffering, reclaiming your energy, how to shift your focus inward and rediscover joy on your own terms, the power of silence, why not every battle needs to be fought, and sometimes, wisdom lies in stillness, letting go of approval, how to free yourself from the endless need to be validated by others. This is not about giving up on love or relationships. It is about finding balance, cherishing what is, and releasing what no longer serves you. Are you ready to walk this path together? 1. The illusion of reciprocity. There is a quiet tragedy that unfolds in the lives of so many. One that is rarely spoken about but universally felt. It is the silent heartbreak of realizing that all the love, care, and sacrifice we have poured into others may not return to us in the way we had hoped. We spend our lives nurturing, supporting, and giving, believing that kindness will inevitably be reciprocated. And yet, as the years pass, we find ourselves staring into the void of unmet expectations, wondering where it all went wrong. I once met an old man named Richard at a quiet park bench in Central Park. He was in his late 70s, dressed neatly, with a pocket watch he often glanced at, as if waiting for someone. I struck up a conversation with him, and soon, his story unraveled like an old book, its pages worn but filled with wisdom. Richard had spent his entire life working to build a future for his family. As a young man, he had taken on multiple jobs to ensure his children had every opportunity he never did. Late nights, early mornings, he had given everything, not just financially but emotionally. He was there for every school recital, every scraped knee, every late-night phone call when his children needed advice. And for a long time, he believed that this devotion would come full circle. But as time passed, the phone calls grew less frequent. Family dinners became rare, then non-existent. His children, now adults with their own lives, had moved on, too busy to look back. They loved him, yes, but in the way one loves a memory. Distantly, fondly, but without urgency. He told me about the countless times he had picked up the phone to call them, only to be met with hurried conversations and promises of, "I'll visit soon, Dad," but soon never came. He would sit by his window, watching the seasons change, hoping for a knock on the door that rarely arrived. One day, He realized that he had spent his whole life preparing for a future where love would be returned in equal measure, only to find himself in a present where he was alone. At first, he was angry, not at his children, but at life itself. He had done everything right, hadn't he? He had given selflessly, worked tirelessly, and loved unconditionally. So why was he left behind? It was in his solitude that Richard began to understand something profound. Love, when tied to expectation, becomes a contract that no one else has agreed to sign. We assume that if we give, we will receive, that if we are loyal, others will be loyal in return. But life does not operate on a system of fair trade. I was reminded of a similar story, one that played out on the world stage. Princess Diana, beloved by millions, spent her life devoted to causes greater than herself. She gave her heart to humanitarian efforts, children in need, and a marriage she believed in. And yet, behind the grandeur and public admiration, she often found herself alone, misunderstood, and yearning for the very love she had so freely given. Even the most cherished figures in history are not exempt from the disillusionment of unreciprocated love. The truth is, we do not own the love we give. It is a gift, not a currency. When we give with the expectation of return, we set ourselves up for heartbreak. But when we give simply because it aligns with who we are, the act itself becomes enough. Richard told me that his greatest moment of peace came the day he stopped waiting. Instead of longing for what had not been returned, he turned inward. He started taking himself out to dinner, something he had once reserved for family occasions. He picked up painting, an old hobby he had abandoned in his youth. He stopped measuring love in visits and phone calls, and instead, found it in the little moments. Watching the sunrise, feeding the birds, smiling at strangers. He told me something I will never forget: if you only love to be loved in return, you will spend your whole life keeping score. But if you love simply because that's who you are, you will never run out. That conversation stayed with me long after I left the park that day. And it made me think, how often do we place conditions on our love without even realizing it? How often do we tally up our sacrifices and expect life to balance the equation? And how much suffering do we bring upon ourselves when it doesn't? Perhaps the key to peace is not in changing how others respond to us, but in changing how we define love itself. Imagine a river. Does it demand the rain to fill it? Or does it simply flow, knowing that its purpose is not to receive but to move forward? There is a quiet power in letting go of expectations. It does not mean we stop loving or that we stop hoping for connection. It means we release the need for reciprocity as a condition of our happiness. We cherish the love that is present, rather than mourning the love that is absent. I think of Richard often, and I wonder how many others like him are sitting by their windows, waiting for something that may never come. And I hope, with all my heart, that one day they realize, just as he did, that they have been enough all along. And so I leave you with this question: if you stopped expecting love to return in a certain way, how much freer would your heart feel? 2. A story of unconditional love. May had spent her entire life being the glue that held everyone together. She was the eldest of 5 siblings, the one who always made sure there was food on the table, the one who stayed up late helping with homework, and the one who sacrificed her own dreams so that her family could chase theirs. When she married, she carried that same unwavering devotion into her new life. She built a home, raised her children with care, and gave everything she had to ensure that those around her felt loved, safe, and supported. Her house had once been filled with the sound of laughter, children running through the halls, the smell of home-cooked meals filling the air, late-night conversations by the fireplace. But as the years passed, the noise faded. One by one, her children grew up and moved away. Her siblings became preoccupied with their own lives, and even the man she had built her world around had passed, leaving her with an empty house and an even emptier heart. At first, she tried to fill the silence. She called her children often, inviting them over for dinners, reminding them of birthdays, holidays, and traditions she had so carefully built over the years. They loved her, of course, but life was busy. "Next weekend, Mom," they would say. But weekends came and went, and the seats at her dining table remained empty. She found herself sitting in the very same living room where she had once cradled them as babies. Only now she was alone, holding nothing but memories. She began to wonder, had she done something wrong? Had she not given enough? Had she loved too much, too selflessly? without setting expectations? There was a time when this realization broke her. She felt abandoned, unappreciated, almost invisible. It was as if all the love she had given had disappeared into some void, never to be returned. But as time passed, as she sat with her thoughts and allowed herself to feel the grief, she came to understand something that changed her forever. Love is not a transaction. It is not a contract that guarantees a return. It is a gift, freely given, without expectation. She thought back to all the times she had given, not because she wanted something in return, but because it was simply who she was. She had loved because love was her nature, not because she was keeping a tally of what she was owed. The pain she was feeling wasn't from love itself, but from the expectation that love would return in the exact way she had given it. She remembered something she had read in a Buddhist text long ago: clinging leads to suffering. She had spent years holding on to an idea of love that was built on reciprocity. But love, when truly pure, is not about receiving, it is about being. So, she decided to let go. She stopped waiting for the phone to ring and instead found joy in the sound of birds outside her window. She stopped setting the table for guests who never arrived and instead learned to enjoy meals with herself, appreciating the stillness that came with solitude. She stopped filling her days with longing and regret and instead started filling them with things she had always wanted to do but never made time for. Gardening, reading, even painting, something she hadn't done since she was a child. One day, while walking through a quiet park, she met an elderly man named George. He was sitting on a bench, feeding the pigeons, and something about him radiated peace. They struck up a conversation, and she told him about her journey, about the heartbreak, the loneliness, the realization that love is not something to be possessed. George smiled and said, "You know, I used to feel the same way. I spent years wondering why the love I gave wasn't always returned in the way I expected. Then, one day, I watched the trees. They give shade freely to anyone who walks beneath them. They do not ask for gratitude. They do not demand that someone return the favor. They simply give because it is in their nature to do so." That conversation stayed with her. She began to see love not as something to be measured, but as something to be lived. She loved because it made her happy, because it aligned with who she was. And in that shift, she found something remarkable: freedom. She still loved her children, of course, but she no longer needed them to validate her love. She still cherished the memories of her late husband, but she no longer clung to the idea that her happiness depended on what once was. She had, for the first time in her life, learned to love without attachment. Years passed, and one day, her daughter called unexpectedly. "Mom, can I come visit this weekend?" May smiled. "Of course," she said warmly, though she no longer needed the visit to feel whole. She had already found her peace. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all. When you stop needing love to be returned, you finally become free to experience love in its purest form. So now, I ask you, how much of your suffering comes not from love itself, but from your expectations of how it should be returned? And what would your life look like if you let love be as effortless as the shade of a tree, given freely, without condition, simply because it is who you are? Free, reclaiming your energy. There comes a moment in life when you wake up and realize you've been running on empty. Not just physically, but emotionally, mentally, spiritually. You've spent years, perhaps decades, pouring yourself into others, giving and giving, with the quiet assumption that one day, life would return the favor. But one day, you look around, and you wonder, where did all my energy go? And more importantly, how do I get it back? This is not about giving up on people or shutting yourself off from the world. It's about something far more powerful. It's about choosing yourself, reclaiming your time, your peace, your vitality, because if you don't, no one else will do it for you. I once met a woman named Eleanor, a retired nurse who had spent over 40 years dedicating her life to others. She had been there for every patient, every late-night emergency, every worried family member needing reassurance. She had raised 3 children, cared for aging parents, and sacrificed countless dreams to make sure everyone else was okay. But when she finally stepped away from her career, when her children had all moved out, she felt something she hadn't expected: exhaustion. But more than that, emptiness. For months, she found herself wandering through her days, unsure of what to do with all the time she suddenly had. She had given so much of herself to others that she had forgotten how to give to herself. One afternoon, While sitting at a cafe, she overheard a group of young people talking about their dreams, traveling, learning new skills, embracing life. She felt an ache in her chest. Not regret, exactly, but a quiet longing, a realization. She had spent so much time living for others that she had forgotten how to live for herself. That day, she made a decision. She was going to reclaim her energy. Not by waiting for life to hand it back to her, but by taking it. She signed up for a painting class, something she had loved as a child but abandoned when life got too busy. The first time she picked up a brush, her hands trembled, the strokes were shaky, the colors uncertain, but she felt something she hadn't in years. Excitement. She started taking morning walks, not with the purpose of exercise, but simply to feel the wind on her face. She booked a solo trip to Italy, a place she had always dreamed of visiting but had never made time for. She sat in a quiet cafe in Rome, sipping espresso, watching the world go by, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel guilty for existing just for herself. There's something truly liberating about reclaiming your energy. It doesn't mean you stop caring for others. It means you stop abandoning yourself in the process. I think of figures like Maya Angelou, who spent her life pouring wisdom and poetry into the world but never lost herself in the process. She once said, "I can be changed by what happens to me, but I refuse to be reduced by it." That is the essence of reclaiming your energy. Not letting the weight of life diminish who you are, but instead, choosing to refill your own cup before offering it to others. Too often, we believe self-care is a luxury, something to be indulged in only after everyone else's needs have been met. But what if we've had it backward all along? What if taking care of ourselves is not an afterthought, but the very foundation of a meaningful life? I once asked a friend, an elderly man named Thomas, what he wished he had done differently in life. He smiled and said, "I wish I had stopped chasing people who weren't meant to stay. I wish I had spent less time worrying about what others thought and more time doing what made me feel alive." I let that sink in. How much of our energy do we spend chasing things? Approval, recognition, relationships that no longer serve us, while neglecting the simple joys that are right in front of us? Reclaiming your energy is not selfish. It is necessary. Maybe you always wanted to write a book but told yourself it was impractical. Maybe you loved dancing but stopped because someone once made you feel silly. Maybe you long to travel but have convinced yourself it's too late. Let me tell you something. It is never too late to reclaim what is yours. It is never too late to wake up one morning and decide that your life is still yours to shape. So take the trip, write the book, sign up for the class, learn the instrument, take yourself out to dinner. Choose yourself, unapologetically, without waiting for permission, and ask yourself this: if you stopped pouring all your energy into things that drain you, what kind of life could you create instead? 4. A story of renewal. There is a quiet kind of grief that comes with realizing the world no longer waits for you. That life, which once revolved around your purpose, has shifted, leaving you standing still in a place that once felt so familiar, now unfamiliar in its silence. Mr. Huang had spent most of his life in the company of students. He had dedicated 40 years to the classroom, pouring his energy into teaching, mentoring, and shaping young minds. His days had been filled with voices, questions, laughter, the eager energy of youth filling the hallways. He had thought that when he retired, he would be surrounded by the people whose lives he had once impacted. That his students would visit, that his phone would ring, that his presence would still matter. But life moved on. The students he had nurtured grew into adults, consumed by their own ambitions. The colleagues he had spent decades working alongside slowly faded into their own retirements, their own lives, and the school, the place he had given so much of himself to, had replaced him with a younger teacher. Someone fresh, someone full of the same energy he had once possessed. He hadn't realized how much of his identity was wrapped up in being needed until he wasn't needed anymore. At first, he tried to fill the void with routine. He would wake up early, just as he always had, only to realize there was nowhere he needed to be. He would brew his tea, read the newspaper, take long walks in the park, but the days stretched out, empty and quiet, the hours passing slower than they ever had before. He tried calling old friends, but conversations felt brief, distant. Everyone seemed to be busy with something else. He found himself sitting by the window, watching the world move on without him, wondering what was left for him now. One afternoon, An old friend came to visit. She had known him since they were young, before careers and responsibilities had taken over their lives. She listened to him talk about the loneliness, the restlessness, the sense of fading into the background of his own existence. And then she said something that surprised him. "You've spent your whole life giving to others. Maybe it's time to give something back to yourself." She handed him a violin. At first, he laughed. "I'm too old to learn something new," he said, but she just smiled and told him that if he had time to sit by the window waiting for the past to come back, he had time to pick up something new. So he tried. The first few weeks were frustrating. His fingers felt stiff, clumsy. The bow felt unnatural in his hands. The notes he played were rough, uneven. He almost gave up, but something inside him, maybe the part of him that had once believed in his students even when they doubted themselves, told him to keep going. And then, one day, something miraculous happened. The music began to flow. Not perfectly, but beautifully in its own way. He found himself getting lost in the sound, in the rhythm of learning, in the small victories of each note played correctly. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't in a long time, a sense of fulfillment that had nothing to do with being needed by others. It was just for him. He began playing every morning, letting the music fill the quiet spaces of his home. He played in the park, where strangers would stop and listen. He even started teaching other retirees how to play, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. Slowly, the loneliness faded, not because the past came back to him, but because he had stepped forward into something new. Reclaiming your energy is not about going back to what once was. It's about rediscovering yourself in the present. It's about realizing that your purpose is not defined by who needs you, but by what makes you feel alive. So many of us spend our lives burning like candles for others, giving until there is nothing left. But even a candle must be replenished, or else, what light will remain? Mr. Huang learned that it is never too late to begin again. That renewal is not reserved for the young, and that passion does not have an expiration date. He found joy in something he never expected, and in doing so, he found himself again. And maybe that is the greatest lesson of all. That life is not about holding on to the past, but about finding new ways to keep the fire inside us burning. So I ask you, if you let go of who you used to be, what new version of yourself could you discover? 5. The power of silence. There was a time when I believed that words were the most powerful tool a person could possess. That the ability to articulate, to argue, to defend oneself was the key to being understood. I thought that if I explained myself well enough, people would see my point of view. If I just said the right things, I could change the way they thought, the way they acted. But life has a way of teaching us lessons we never expected to learn. I remember a conversation I had with my grandfather when I was younger. He was a quiet man, the kind who never spoke unless he had something worth saying. One evening, I sat across from him at the dinner table, frustrated about a debate I had gotten into with a friend. "I don't get it," I said. I made my argument clear. I had facts, logic, but they still didn't see my side. He looked at me with the kind of patience that only comes with age and said, "Did you want to be heard? Or did you want to be right?" That question stuck with me for years. As we grow older, we begin to realize that most people do not listen to understand, they listen to reply. Conversations become battlegrounds of opinions, where people are more concerned with winning than with learning. We raise our voices, hoping to be heard over the noise. But in doing so, we only contribute to the chaos. Buddhism teaches that right speech, samavaka, is not about remaining silent at all times, but about choosing words wisely. Speak only when necessary, and when words do not serve a purpose of truth and kindness. Silence is often the wiser path. I once read a story about Mahatma Gandhi, a man who led one of the most powerful revolutions in history. Not through force, but through quiet resilience. One day, a reporter asked him why he so often chose silence over debate. Gandhi smiled and said, "Speak only if it improves upon the silence." I didn't fully understand the weight of that statement until I found myself in a situation where silence was my only answer. A few years ago, I was in a room full of people, each one eager to prove their point. Voices overlapped, opinions clashed, and it felt as if everyone was talking, but no one was truly listening. I could feel the impulse rising in me. The need to interject, to offer my perspective, to correct the things I knew were wrong. But something held me back. Instead of speaking, I observed, and in that moment of stillness, I saw things I never would have noticed if I had been caught up in the argument. I saw how people's faces changed when they felt unheard. I saw how words, once spoken, couldn't be taken back. I saw how the loudest voice in the room wasn't necessarily the most respected. Silence, I realized, was not weakness, it was power. In a world that prizes noise, constant notifications, arguments, opinions, it takes strength to choose stillness. True power does not lie in how much one speaks, but in how much one understands without needing to say a word. There is an old Zen proverb that says, "Do not speak unless you can improve the silence." How many of us truly live by that? How often do we speak simply to fill the space, to make our presence known, to validate our own existence? And how often do we regret the words we let slip in anger, in pride, in moments of frustration? I think of great leaders, philosophers, and thinkers, people who shaped history not by shouting the loudest, but by mastering the art of silence. Martin Luther King Jr. did not scream his way into history. He spoke with a kind of measured wisdom that made people lean in, listen, and reflect. The Dalai Lama, when faced with hostility, does not retaliate with harsh words, but with an unshakable calm. And then I think of the people in our own lives, the ones we admire, the ones whose presence alone brings a sense of peace. They are not the ones who dominate conversations. They are the ones who listen, who pause before they speak, who choose their words carefully, knowing that not everything needs a response. I have come to understand that silence is not about passivity. It is about control, the control to step back when emotions are high, the control to let go of the need to prove something, the control to recognize that not every battle is worth fighting. There was a moment in my life when I stood at a crossroads with someone I deeply cared about. We had different perspectives, different truths. The younger version of me would have fought to be understood. But instead, I chose to listen, to let silence hold the space where words might have only caused more harm. And in that silence, something incredible happened. The conversation softened, the tension eased, and for the first time, we saw each other, not as adversaries, but as two human beings doing the best we could. Silence, when used with intention, is not the absence of communication. It is the deepest form of it. So now, I leave you with this question. How much more could you understand if you listened more than you spoke? As we come to the end of this journey, take a moment to reflect on what truly matters. We spend so much of our lives chasing love, validation, belonging. We shape ourselves to fit the needs of others, believing that if we give enough, we will be loved in return. But love, like water, cannot be forced into a container of expectations. It must flow naturally, without demands, without conditions. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: your worth is not determined by how much you are needed, but by how much you honor yourself. There is no shame in stepping back, no guilt in choosing peace. You are not obligated to chase after those who have outgrown you, nor to beg for recognition from those too busy to see you. Instead, turn inward, find joy in your own presence. Read that book you always meant to read. Take that trip you kept postponing. Wake up each morning with a heart free from the weight of expectations. Because at the end of the day, peace is not something given, it is something claimed. So now, I leave you with one final question. What would your life look like if you stopped seeking approval and started living for yourself? Let that question sit with you. Let it guide you toward a path of true freedom. And if this message has touched you, if even a small part of you feels a shift within, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue this journey together. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this message, because the more we spread wisdom, the more light we bring into the world. Until next time, take care of yourself. You are worth it.